was great. That's what I wanted to do. Jimmy Buffett was big in my career. Bless him. He's no longer with us, but he was very, very important. I think he has a lot to do with my taste for rum. That's just, it sort of came with the Jacques Cousteau. Red wine never did it for me, but rum always has. And then my mom and dad. Dad's gone. Mom lives on Vashon Island. She's going to be 99 in July. And she was here a week ago, 2 weeks ago. My brother flew her over from Vashon to spend the day with us. So that's sort of, how I got to where I am. And then this group of people, Jean, our 2 daughters, me, we have a granddaughter. This is an old picture. I should be shot for not having our granddaughter in here, but you all get, if you hang around us long enough, you get to meet Poppy too. Okay, so turning to life, I did a lot of my early life in national estuarine parks. I didn't start off that way, but it happened. I started working early on. My first field research was in Rookery Bay National Estuarine Park in south of Naples, Florida. I'm from Naples originally, grew up in Tallahassee. When we moved to Tallahassee, I went to Florida State University, and I started doing research in Apalachicola Bay, which is now the Apalachicola National Estuarine Reserve. So I worked on this whole river and bay system. I worked for a sort of a gangster ecologist, a guy that just said, collect everything and then look for patterns. That was his goal was water chemistry, algae, plants, animals, anything you could catch, collect it all, figure out what it was, figure out what it was eating, and then try to find out what the connections were among everything. So I'm really, it's going to go back. We're going to make a big circle here in the end. I'm a systems ecologist kind of person. I got my bachelor's at Florida State in 1981, my master's in 1985 at Florida State. I was a soft money funded employee at a university research center. So we lived by our wits and we did what got funded. We did what we wanted to do, but it ended up being, we did what got funded. I worked on seagrass. I tortured Thalassia in enclosure cages with sea urchin exclusion and sea urchin inclusion and saw what happened to their growth rates. And you know what happens in master's research. In the field ecology, the answer is, I don't know. There's too much noise to pull a signal out of it, but it was really fun research. He says confidently. Okay, so I moved from one center at Florida State University to a second one. The life as being a field biologist, it was wonderful. You had a boat, you spent out your time in the field, had a great tan, ate a lot of seafood, but you didn't make much money. I think the raise I got for my bachelor's and my master's degrees was $2,000 a year. That was it's just like, we're not gonna make a lot of money. This other research center at Florida State came along and said, how would you like to come work for us? We do toxicological research, and it's all office work. I'm like, that's boring. And they said, what if we doubled your salary? It's like, and so I went to work for them. And we did all sorts of interesting things. We looked at where we sited municipal waste combustion ash disposal facilities with respect to wetlands. This was very, very early GIS work, where we had to actually digitize the maps ourselves with a, click, 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 to actually digitize the maps, then place the locations on them and see how far they were. It was a really interesting stuff. We got involved, and this is, again, soft money funded research, so we went from there to Department of Energy funded research. Department of Energy was very interested in environmental cleanup, cleaning up the mess we'd made creating nuclear weapons across the complex in the United States. And they had a lot of money and they were willing to go anywhere to do good research. And they asked us to work in Central and Eastern Europe. It's a long story, but the center I was with had connections in that part of the world. And so we were essentially being program managers for the Department of Energy in Central and Eastern Europe, finding promising research projects, investing in them, and then trying to bring the results back to inform Department of Energy's cleanup mission. Really interesting stuff. We put on a series of international symposia. These are like 800-person meetings that we did every other year for 10 years in Central and Eastern Europe. And this was from the early 1990s. This was not long after the Iron Curtain had come down. And nobody had done this kind of work. Nobody had, it was East and West coming together, and really interesting to talk to Eastern European scientists. And so we put on these meetings, got US companies, there were a lot of US companies involved, interested in getting over there and finding out what was going on. That was a lot of fun. But again, soft money funded, supported by the federal government in most cases, and sort of living by your wits and doing what you got funded to do. At some point in the middle of all this, my boss convinced me that I needed to have a PhD. I didn't want to go back to school. I didn't like being in school. I was a mediocre student. And my boss is like, Mike, if you want to be in science, you got to have a PhD, or you're going to be working for somebody the rest of your life. And everybody works for somebody else, but there's some truth to that. That's sort of, the pinnacle of being a scientist. So I went across town to Florida A&M University, and in their College of Pharmacy, I wanted to study organophosphate pesticides. I wanted to study anything environmental. They were a College of Pharmacology, and they wanted to study drugs. And it was fascinating because, it's the two sides of the same coin. But when I took my toxicokinetics class, my environmental chemical kinetics class, what he wanted to talk about was pharmacokinetics. And he said, okay, when you dose a patient, wait. If an organism is exposed to a chemical, so it was a really interesting, brand new environmental toxicology program. I was the second student to enroll in the program and the fourth student to graduate. And my wife's smiling and nodding her head in the background because it took me a long time to finish my degree. Anyway, I worked on trying to understand exposure. If you get exposed to organophosphate pesticide, what's really interesting, one of the things is your temperature spikes. And we were trying to figure out why, what the neural mechanisms are between the interactions between this pesticide and body temperature. Anyway, that's what I did my PhD in, published a couple of papers, never looked back, and went on to do other things. I was really getting tired of begging for money and writing proposals and going where the path took you. And I said to the Department of Energy, who was funding us at the time, I said, would you ever consider letting me come to Washington and play on your side of the fence? And they said, yeah, we do this all the time. We borrow people from the university. So they wrote a grant to Florida State University to pay my salary for 2 years. And we picked up the whole family and we moved from Tallahassee, Florida to Bethesda, to the DC metro area. And it turned out that being a program manager was a lot more fun. Having $20 million in your pocket and giving it to people was a lot more fun than begging for money and getting people calling up and saying, no, we don't want to fund that. So that's where I ended up DOE in the Office of Science. I got into some really interesting things. I'll talk about this in more detail. This is called the free air CO2 enrichment experiment that we sponsored from DOE. This is called the Next Generation Ecosystem Experiment. This is Barrow, Alaska, Utqiagvik, Alaska, where we're doing manipulations in permafrost and looking at carbon cycling in permafrost. This is the federal government's research facilities in Barrow at the time, now Utqiagvik. The ARM research facility, the one in the middle, the ARM Climate Research Facility, is a very, very big atmospheric science observation program that's been zeroed out in the president's 2026 budget request. So that may be on its way out too. I was at DOE for about 10 years when I got involved in climate change research. The White House called up and said, would you be willing to come and spend a couple of years working for us in the White House at the Office of Science and Technology Policy? It's like, yes, I would. That sounds like fun. And so what happens is the White House goes to the Department of Energy and says, we'd like to borrow Mike. And the Department of Energy, oh, and you need to keep paying his salary. And the Department of Energy goes, sure, that would be wonderful. We'd love to do that. And so off I went to OSTP, where I became the executive director of something called the US Global Change Research Program. And I was there from 2015 to 2025 with one notable 6-month period that we can talk about later if you want to. I worked on Arctic stuff while I was there. When you work for the White House, you have a job, but you also do other things, whatever comes along. And it was a lot of fun. I worked on Arctic research coordination. I also worked on the US role in AMAP, the Arctic Council's Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. So visited a lot of really interesting European Arctic countries and cities and had a blast studying that. Working with indigenous peoples, learned a lot about indigenous interactions and how they relate to science and how they relate to governments in those roles. So, how I think about things. This is my grandfather, my dad's father. Tell the truth, you don't have to remember what you said. I think this is partly because Kuperberg men have a notoriously bad memory, but it has a good thing too. This is my dad. If you tell a man a bridge won't support him, he'll believe you. If you tell him the wetlands are essential to water quality, he'll build it as a swamp anyway. We're still seeing this happening, right? It's really amazing what people will accept and understand and what they won't. And then this is one of my mentors in the federal government, Brad Smith's mantra was, are we doing the right thing? Make sure we do the right thing. I think we all work with motivated, smart people. I feel that way, I have felt that way, and I feel that way now. Give them direction and feedback and stay out of their way. And let them, they're the experts in what they're doing. And that's, I'm here to help help make people do good things. Expect the people you work with to be that way. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you expect people to be smart and motivated, they tend to be smart and motivated. They tend to act smart and motivated. Play to your strengths. I really don't like being forced to do things I'm not good at doing. And I think that's, everybody's that way. Everybody has strengths and weaknesses, and I think it's important to play to your own strengths and other people's as well. Be open and direct. I think to a fault, I'm open and direct, and I will continue to be that way. Treat everybody with respect. Remember, this ought to be fun. It's not just a job. If it's not fun, you shouldn't be doing it. And then be able to tell a story. Everybody around me has heard this multiple times lately. I think this is critically important, and we'll talk about this with the Whale Museum later on. You've got to have a story. You've got to be able to tell it. What is it? What are you about? What are we about? What we, the bigger and the smaller we. Uh-oh. Okay. Know your priorities. What's important? And because often you have to make critical decisions and you want to make sure you protect the priorities. Assess your progress, the future, where you're going. Don't be afraid of change. Change is a good thing. Every time I've been through a change, and Gene and I are going through a big change right now, when you look back on it, it was like, that was great. It was a really good thing. It sort of forced you to think about new things and worry about things and not be sort of stuck in a rut. Don't be afraid of change. Do a few things really well. That goes back to, play to your strengths. Look for accomplishments and be ready for opportunities. Be ready. I'll give you a quick example. When I worked in the Department of Energy, there was a guy named Mike Riches who controlled the budget. This was a $10 billion a year operation. And, Mike would be balancing the books, and he'd walk into your office. It was always Friday, and it was always like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He'd say, hey, I just found, pick a number, $250,000. It's got to be spent before Monday. What can you do? And you go, this PI wants to know it can't be equipment. It's like, okay, and you had to have a pocket full of good ideas because opportunity knocks, and you can't say, can you come back in a week and I'll have a good idea for you. And we're talking about this now. A lady walked into the front office here 2 weeks ago with her checkbook open and said, I want to write a check. What do you need? What does the program need? And so you can't go, well, could you come back, in a week? It's like, you've got to have a pocket full of ideas and be ready to implement them. Be accessible and responsive, provide quality products. My boss, my mentor at Florida State University was a stickler. We would go round and round and round and round on reports with him editing them and, changing them and taking them apart. And when we finally started editing things back to something they'd been before, we kind of knew that we'd reached, the pinnacle of success. Okay, a few examples of things I've done and why they were important. So this is the Environmental Molecular Sciences Laboratory at Pacific Northwest National Lab. EMSL is a $5.5 million a year operation. It brings a whole bunch of molecular scale analytical capabilities in one place, and it's a user facility. Department of Energy is big on this. User facilities means the Department of Energy provides the resource to you, and you as a scientist put in an application and said, I would like to make the following kinds of measurements in your facility. These are synchrotron radiation sources, spallation neutron sources. Department of Energy builds these gigantic, in many cases, machines. And then the scientific community proposes research, and you get the research for free. It's like being funded, right? They say, yes, you may have like a supercomputer. You may have 100 million processor hours on the new supercomputer. We award your... So EMSL's the same thing, but instead of one big machine, it's a collection of a lot of really high-end molecular scale analytical capabilities, HP, MS, mass spectroscopy, that sort of thing, and smart people that know how to use them. And so you come and say, I've got these soil samples. I'm trying to understand the valent state of uranium and blah, 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 under these conditions. They go, ooh, yeah, we'll stick it in here, and then we'll take the output from there, we'll put it in this other machine, and we can... So that's what EMSL's about. $5 million a year, lots and lots of research getting done. But we had a big formal review done, and the Department of Energy's reviewer came back and he said, if this was my project, I'd fire every one of you that are in charge of it, and I'd call for the project to be terminated. Like, oh, that's not good. But what happened was, because we were under the gun, we were able to make changes in the way the place operated and worked. So the message here is that sometimes these bad things that happen gives you an opportunity that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And so that was one of those opportunities. Was we got a chance to rethink how EMSL operated and what it did. Ameriflux, this is a a coalition of the willing around the country. So eddy flux measurements combines two technologies, sonic anemometers and instantaneous CO2 measurements. So if you can tell which way the wind's blowing and what the CO2 concentration is instantly, continuously over time, you can figure out where the CO2 is coming from and where it's going. Okay, that's as far as I understand this. Don't ask me any more questions about it because I don't understand how it works, but it can be done. And so they use, this is that combination, it's the sonic anemometer in the picture, and they set up these towers in natural settings. And the question is, how much CO2 does a salt marsh take up or give off, for that matter? How much, how about a forest, a young forest, a new forest, a wheat field? This all gets factored into Earth system models. They're trying to understand what the balance of carbon uptake and uptake and release is. And because ultimately we're trying to get Earth system models to help predict what future CO2 concentration is going to be. This is one of the ways you measure natural systems. This group of people had been doing this sort of thing for years and years and years, and we funded some of them, and they wrote proposals, and we reviewed the proposals, and if they did well, we funded them. If they didn't do well, they didn't fund. And I got a phone call from a PI one day that said, Mike, it's your decision. I'm not arguing with your decision, but your decision not to fund our research will terminate the longest standing record of CO2 concentration, these measurements in the country. And we think that's really important. Why don't you go ask your modelers what they think about that? And we went to ask the modelers. Modelers say, yeah, we need these long-term records, you should keep doing them. Like, well, this is a dumb way to fund this research. We should do it differently. And we changed the way we funded the research. We took money out of the research pot and we gave it to one organization and said, you fund these long-term sites, and we're not going to compete research-wise to do it. You'll get dedicated funding, just do it. I mentioned FACE. That was that first experiment with that first big green forest with all the towers sticking up in it. This is only the Department of Energy would do this kind of stuff. These experiments were intended, the question is, do plants grow faster when CO2 concentrations go up? This has been an argument for years and years and years. CO2 is plant food. What's the big deal? Put more CO2 in the atmosphere, all the plants grow faster. What's the big deal? Why are we worried about this? Free air CO2 enrichment experiments were designed to answer that question. And so DOE did this at DOE scale, like forests. We put towers up and we ringed like half-acre sites of forest with these towers and CO2 jets in the top of them. And again, sonic anemometers, so we knew which way the wind was blowing, and they're all set up so when the wind's blowing left to right, we introduce CO2 on the left-hand side of the forest. When wind's blowing from right to left, we introduce CO2 on the right-hand side of the forest. And we introduced CO2 in these forests for like a decade. We were spending $1 million a year on CO2, like buying tanker trucks full of CO2 and driving it to these forests. It was nuts. But it answered the question that people have been doing in the laboratory. In the laboratory, you get laboratory results. Out here, what you find is that, yeah, they grow faster until they run out of something else. I mean, this is one of those like, duh kind of things. But we quantified it and we proved it. And we said that, yeah, they grow faster, but eventually they run out of nitrogen, they run out of water, they run out of something else becomes a limiting factor, which shouldn't be surprising to anybody. But this was the documentation, and it helped us do a much better job of representing natural systems in our system models, which is the whole goal of what we're doing there. And then finally, the work we did in the Arctic. This is a group of us, that's me, just right of yellow boots, that's Charlene in the yellow boots, my boss at the time, standing in disturbed permafrost in Utqiagvik, Alaska. Fascinating. I don't know if any of you are permafrost people, forgive my simple-minded explanation of this. But this is places where the government came in, the military came in World War II era and dug some trenches to, I don't know what, to lay cables or something. And what you see, this rugged terrain, is it's still scarred. Because as soon as you disturb permafrost, it changes the heat balance in it, and the places near the edges start melting or thawing and slumping, and the parts on the edges get hard and dry. And so you get these really hard, dry surfaces, and in between them, there's these soft, soggy places where previously it used to be flat land. Really, really interesting example of what happens when you disturb a very sensitive and delicate system. In this case, the reason we were there is because there's more carbon trapped in permafrost than exists in the atmosphere currently. And until 10 years ago, that carbon wasn't accounted for in our system models. So the models could not predict what happened when permafrost warmed and thawed, and it just wasn't there. It couldn't possibly get in the atmosphere because the models didn't deal with it. And I'm not picking on modelers. Models, there's lots of things that models don't do. This is one of them. This is one that we decided was important and we picked on it. And we closed down the free air CO2 experiments. We recouped $10 million a year by terminating those experiments. And Spencer, we funded the graduate students to finish their work. We didn't just stop. We did it in a I don't know what the PIs would say, but I thought it was a humane way of doing it. We gave them years of notice and terminated them slowly. We took that $10 million a year and we invested it in this thing called the Next Generation Ecosystem Experiment, was trying to understand what happens when permafrost thaws, make the right measurements, and make sure the modelers are involved with the field scientists, which was a breakthrough. Because otherwise the field scientists go off and they do stuff at field scale, and the modelers go, I don't care about centimeter to centimeter. My model is, whatever, a kilometer on a side. There's no point in making 15 measurements inside the same root ball. So fascinating experiment. It's wrapping up this year or next year. And now we have permafrost carbon represented in all the major Earth system models of the world. So then I mentioned I went to work for the White House. I started work for something called the US Global Change Research Program. Presidential initiative in 1989. Who knows who was president in 1989? This is Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan signed an executive order, some sort of executive action that said, global change research is too important to be just done willy-nilly. I want all the agencies to work together to coordinate their activities. Congress passed a law in 1990 that said the same thing, the Global Change Research Act of 1990, that says the job of the US Global Change Research Program is to assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural causes of global change. And notice they talk about global change. This is a little bit of a, global change isn't climate change. Climate change is a subset of global change. We tend to use those two words interchangeably. We shouldn't, but we did. There are a lot of things that are changing that are not just climate change. But anyway, that's what we worked on. We identified 13 agencies that either make investments in global change research or need the results of global change research, and we got those agencies together. It turned out to be 15 in the end. By the time I left, there were 15 agencies involved. In 2022, those 15 agencies reported $4.2 billion of global change research. So we would go to them and say, here's what global change research is. We had a definition. How much money, how much of your research budget do you spend on this? Because NSF just does science. Department of Energy just does energy research, and USDA just does agriculture research, and NASA observes the Earth from space. So you have to actually go to these agencies and say, how much of all this wonderful stuff you're doing would you characterize as global change research? And we got this $4.2 billion number. So the goal of this program was to coordinate that. We didn't control it. We couldn't make agencies do anything they didn't want to do. But our job was to make sure what they were doing was responsive to national needs and was doing the very best so that DOE knew what NASA was doing and NASA knew what NSF was doing, et cetera, so that we did the best we could with it. We had a wonderful office, 35 people, most of them who've lost their jobs in the last 2 months, supported by a distributed cost budget. And this is one of those things that the administration has taken apart. So this is a quick glance of what USTCRP does. It worked under the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. 2 committees, 2 subcommittees, so I'm somewhere in the middle of all this. Interagency working groups, the National Coordination Office, all working on what I was just talking about through all these different working groups. Right now, the Subcommittee on Climate Services is gone. The National Coordination Office is gone. Interagency groups, I don't know. I don't know what their status is at the moment. The Subcommittee on Global Change Research, I understand, met last month. So there's a heartbeat left, but only a heartbeat left. One of the key things that comes out of the US Global Change Research Program is the National Climate Assessment. The law says every 4 years you will do an assessment that tells us what we understand about global change, the impacts of what we have observed to date of global change on the United States, and the projected impacts into the future. So this is a fairly, if you read the law, there's like a paragraph that describes this. And from that has sprung what, in the 5th National Climate Assessment, 450 authors worked on this thing for 3 years. The National Academy of Sciences reviewed it twice. It was signed by the president. It's a big, hairy deal. This is the cover of the 5th National Climate Assessment. The 6th National Climate Assessment was a year along in process when the election happened, and not too long ago, the new administration, I forget what the word was, dismissed the authors. So there was a whole author team, there was an outline that had been approved, and there was an author team that would begin writing, and they were all dismissed. Okay, so, sorry, I don't want to dwell on bad stuff. So, turning to the Whale Museum, and I want to preface what I'm about to say. These are my personal impressions, this is not Whale Museum policy. I haven't been here long enough to be able to stand up here and say, this is what we are and this is what we're going to do. These are some observations from me. I think we have a slam dunk with killer whales, southern resident killer whales in particular. They're an endangered species. You can't get much, I was going to say you can't get much better than that. I guess that's not a thing to be better about, but it's in terms of visibility and getting people to care, it's a target-rich environment. That's probably not a good thing to say either. Everybody loves killer whales. I sold like 2 stuffed animals today while I was watching the front desk. Everybody loves them. They're great capstone species. I think our job here is to tell the story about whales and marine mammals and the ecosystem they depend on in the museum and on the water. And it's that and the ecosystem they depend on, I think that's where the real opportunity is, that we have this charismatic megafauna, these killer whales that everybody wants to talk and think about, and it's an opportunity to not only educate people about where they are and the risks they face, but what it's going to take to protect and conserve and save them ultimately. And it's things like clean water and abundant prey and habitat for the prey, and as that gets to eelgrass and it gets to fertilizer use in your backyard and it gets to all these wonderful things that we can bring into this story led by this capstone species. So I think there's a really, really cool opportunity here. And this, just if you look at the story we've got in the museum, it's there, but it's something I think we can emphasize and tell a stronger story about. Tell the story. Oh, I only had 1 slide. Okay, so I'll just jabber some more. Tell the story, and you've heard me talk about stories before. I think this is really, really important. I said this to the board when they interviewed me back last year, and it won't surprise anybody here, because I struggle to put this all together into a story. That we're doing a bunch of wonderful things here. And every one of them is, and it's Soundwatch, and it's Be Whale Wise, it's the sighting networks, and it's stranding networks, and it's the work that Tracy does in education, and the physical museum itself, and the exhibits we show here. Trying to tell the story of all of this together, I'm struggling with. And it's something that I'm hoping that we all, the museum and the community here, can all work and think about. And that's the Whale Museum. And then you take the next step and you say, well, how does that relate to the other 5 organizations on the island that have a vested interest and a history in whales? And I don't know the answer to that either. And I'm really, really, we've gotten a chance to talk and work with Giles. I've worked a little bit with Michael Weiss, and we're looking forward to meeting the rest of the group. As Holly and I haven't met in person yet, but we've Zoomed. It wasn't a good day to get from Stuart. So we're working on, and I come in this with no dog in the fight. I'm an advocate for the Whale Museum and what it's doing, and it's doing a good thing, but otherwise it's like, let's figure out how we can all work together and how make this better by us all being together. So, Tracy, how did I do? Okay. So I think maybe with that, I'll stop and say thank you. And happy to chat.
Don't forget to repeat questions.
Will do. Thank you. Okay. Questions? Comments? They don't have to be questions. You're welcome. Giles.
What was the question? Sorry. I don't have a question right now. I just want to say how absolutely thrilled I am and the community is that you're here, and really super excited to be part of the next generation of what the Whale Museum is going to end up looking like. So thank you for coming. Thank you, Jean, for coming. Yeah, so I'm just thrilled.
Giles, for those of you if you couldn't hear what Giles said, it was thank you and our thanks in return. We're thrilled to be here. We're excited about the opportunities, and we want to work with everybody. And I mean everybody, not just the whale folks, but we've had a chance to talk to the San Juan Island Community Foundation and lots and lots of people that I want to get involved with. Thank you. Please.
So I appreciate your comment that to sort of leverage the love of the whale to the love of the ecosystem, and it's a lot easier to love pandas of the sea than it is plankton. And I think that's been a challenge, especially when every whale is named and numbered, and people think that if I can save this whale, I've saved the population, and it was Clinton said it's the economy stupid, well, it's the ecosystem stupid, and I think that's our challenge. I think it's to leverage that and bring it to the bigger system. What does it take to have a top predator? And I really appreciate you acknowledging that, and we're almost like we've created a problem almost because we've adopted individuals. But now that we got your attention, let me tell you what's really important.
I think that's the way to do this. And I don't want to reinvent things here and say we shouldn't name whales and we shouldn't, protecting one by one is, it may be necessary, but it's not sufficient. And I completely agree. And I think that's we need to take the opportunity of people that come to the Whale Museum to talk about whales to make sure they leave the Whale Museum with a broader understanding of what whales mean or what the world means for whales.
And thank you for taking that.
Yeah. Thanks.
Oh, come on, somebody grilled me something.
Yeah. No hard questions? I'm not going to talk about dams. I don't want to talk about dams.
Damn.
I have enough to talk about dams. Comes later.
Well, I mean, I
There's
guess
really
one
nothing to
of the
say.
things that I think is particularly challenging in this area is this dotted line that runs through the waterway that brings us to Canada. And the challenge, obviously, politically right now, our relationships are terrible, but there's different regulations on this side than that side, and just to herd our own people together is hard enough, but then to be able to create some sort of unanimity across the strait, it's a particular challenge. And so historically, I haven't seen the Whale Museum that much engaged in the bilateral stuff, although working with Strait Watch has been an important thing. I'm just wondering your thoughts about looking across the border.
So I had.
You see Canada from here.
Well, look, it turns out what I thought was Canada was actually the Olympic Peninsula, but that's because I was having directionally challenged. I had a chance to go out with Sound Watch on the boat with Alana and the gang, and one of the first questions he asked me is, "Did you bring your passport?" I was like, "No, I hadn't thought to bring my passport with me." And there is a dotted line, and we were close to it, and we stayed on our side of it. I hesitate to jump too far into this because my knowledge is quite thin and not even all that broad. But we're heavily involved in a program called Be Whale-Wise. That is that cross-border, cross-governmental, feds, regional, local, and international, working with Canada. And on those Be Whale-Wise calls, we have our counterparts from Kennedy and DF, And while the Whale Museum is a partner in Be Whale-Wise, we don't lead it. We're one of the participants. Be Whale-Wise is that cross-border opportunity to at least talk about, and we work closely with them. Be Whale-Wise, the messages Be Whale-Wise comes out are endorsed by both countries and the state, and so there are activities going on. Are they solving all the problems? No, because the regulations are still disparate, but there are efforts in place to work on those issues. And my experience with Canadians is I love working with Canadians. They're great. They're
We love
just
it more than they love us now.
probably so. You're probably right.
We want to own them.
I'm not going there, Spencer.
I feel like I should come to the defensive side of LinkedIn as a So one of the, this is more sort of a comment, and you guys have challenges sort of getting people to research ecosystem, particularly the charismatic megafauna. So I, as someone who studies charismatic microfauna, I guess we would call them. So I think it's this, we share similar challenges, right? You need to have someone care about one thing in order to consider another thing. So that's kind of where I'm hoping that if we, any collaborators or ideas just to pitch back and forth, that's kind of what we do. Is we study more, not to say boring, but less exciting things in order to give context to the more important and sort of things that matter personally, emotionally, that people can connect with. I think that's sort of an important aspect to keep in mind. There are things that people care about, just put it all in context.
So if you're online, it was more a commentary than a question, and pointing out that using charismatic megafauna to leverage a more important but less charismatic organism or system that needs to be studied this isn't the first time that's happened, and I completely agree with you, and I think we should leverage that. If people are, if they want to come to the zoo to learn about pandas, great, teach them something else while they're there. I think we have a similar opportunity here.
But having the Friday Harbor Labs right next to the Whale Museum, what a fantastic opportunity to do that.
Well, we went there when I was here in December. Gene and I were here in December, and on our first day here, the group here took us over to Friday Harbor Lab. We met with the director. Turns out the director is old buddies with my former boss at the White House, and so we have a good connection over there. We work closely with the Friday Harbor Lab now, and I think there's only opportunities to make that better and more impactful. Okay, we don't need to draw this out. Tracy? Sorry, I should have given you a warning.
By the way, thank you for screaming. I was able to hear it as I was coming in.
It was working. And Dante, I apologize for not holding still. Dante's been trying to track me as I wandered around the room.
Okay, my little magnet fell off here, so I'm going to hold it and pretend I'm the little piece that's holding it up. There we go. I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight, and definitely thank Mike for kicking off our summer lecture series. And again, I was just so happy that that you were able to kind of introduce yourself to the community, and that so many folks came out today. And thank you if you're joining us online. I have not forgotten about you. And I hope everyone will join us for the other lectures and events this summer. Like I said, next week's going to be our next lecture with Dr. Holly Fernbach. So I wish everyone a safe and nice evening.